Hey guys, Space Marine 658 here. Today we're going to be talking about draw calls and basically how to improve your performance when you're importing models. Now, something that a lot of beginners do when they're first getting into Unreal Engine, no matter what 3D modeling software you're using, when you're exporting a model, a lot of times they're not really paying attention to the actual draw calls or what these specific models are doing. So I kind of want to talk about, not just from beginner, but even just an intermediate perspective, what you can do to reduce your draw calls. So there's a lot of tools in Unreal Engine. There's a lot of things it does on the background. There's a lot of stuff that it does for you by default. But something that a lot of people aren't aware of, if we go ahead and look at these two models here, is that when you are importing a model, every single material it has on that FBX is going to create a draw call. Now, the way it works is your base material is your one draw call. As an example here, I've got a single material on this mesh, and even though it's got a lot of vertices, it's a pretty unoptimized mesh because I intentionally did some subdivision to it. And so while it's actually got quite a few triangles here, I've added 8 LODs for it and the unoptimized version, but it's a single draw call, even though it's got all of those primitives. If we go ahead and look at the unoptimized version here, it's got the exact same amount of primitives, but because it's got LODs, what's happening is all of these extra materials are not just adding draw calls, but they actually affect the amount of primitives displayed on the screen, because the engine only knows so much about the materials and where they're at. So you can see here, even though that, let's try to get a similar screen size here. Try to get in fact, we can get a higher screen size here. This has a lower triangle and vertices count compared to this simply because of how many materials it has. Now, if we actually go ahead and take a look at these at a larger scale, as you can see here, I'm recording, so performance is a little shit, but we're running about 60 to 70 frames per second. We go ahead and construct the unoptimized version. So this is the version that has all of those extra materials there. Let me move so you can kind of see the numbers there. So we're looking at about 1,500 draw calls, and that's because 6 materials times 50 boxes along one edge, 50 boxes along another edge makes about 15,000 draw calls. And then there's a little bit of overhead just from, the sky sphere and stuff going on in the background, because I didn't want it to be a boring black screen. I could do that, save a little bit more performance, but it's not realistic to your setting. Your game's probably going to have skies. But you can see it's running at 15,000 draw calls, which is a lot of draw calls. And as such, it's eating up a lot of GPU time. It's eating up a lot of frame time. And so our FPS dropped to about 35, 36. But if we go ahead and clear this out, we'll climb back up and then we'll construct our optimized version. So this is the version with a single material. And you can see here, while we lost a little bit of performance, we're still sitting in the high 50s, 60s. So we're not that far off from what we were before. And our draw calls are significantly lower. Like if we look, we're at almost 3,000 draw calls, which if you remove that 400 overhead, 2,500 draw calls makes sense because we have about 2,500 cubes on the screen, because 50 by 50 is roughly 2,500. Now, of course, different things you can do, nanite, LODs, you can do different things to get more performance and tweak things around. Of course, I've added 8 LODs for both. But you could, maybe tailor your LODs to be more specific. But the big thing that's going to affect performance, in my opinion, here at least in this example, is going to be how many draw calls. If you're going from a model that has 1 draw call to 2, maybe that performance jump isn't so big. So maybe it's a time savings thing you can do for now, and you can always come back and optimize it later. But a lot of times, new beginners, they'll have very complex or advanced models, either that they themselves created or they imported from the plugins, from like, Fab or anything like that. And they're going to have, sometimes if they're not optimized correctly, you could have, 10, 20 materials, and that's just going to completely kill your performance in terms of draw calls. So this is something I want to bring up and kind of talk about, because you can see here, even in the sample, with the primitives being 1100 versus, we create the unoptimized version. You can see here It's got a lot more primitives because of how many materials are there. And I think that's something that's really important that you need to pay attention to when you're working with your models. But yeah, so that's pretty much it for today. I've been a little sick, so I've been out, so I'm trying to get back in the swing of things. But if you have any more questions about draw calls or materials or like how to actually bake these down, I'm not talking about these specifically when it comes to 3D modeling software, just because there's so many different kinds of 3D model software and they all do things just a little bit differently. In Blender, you bake them down to a single texture and you save that out and you export a model that only has one material, versus it may be done differently in something like Maya 3D and such. But if you have any questions, definitely leave them in the comments below. But otherwise, good luck and good hunting.